All right, and we are back to talk about some Star Wars Unlimited today. This is going to be a little different than our regular podcast. It's just me and Banana. Banana, how you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Uh, I am excited to talk about these cards. Now, I want to say up front, what we are going to do today is look at all the cards that came out in the live stream, and based on the limited information that we have about the game rules for Star Wars Unlimited, we're going to try to do some analysis on these cards. Now, this might not be the most evergreen content. Once we learn more about the game, some of this analysis might be a little sloppy, but the tools that we're going to use to approach is this card good? How is this card going to work in the game? We're going to be comparing them to cards from other games and mechanics from other games. So, big grain of salt with all this, but we want to talk about some cards. So, we're going to do so acknowledging that maybe some of this might not age well. All right, to start, I want to begin with Leia Organa. So this is a 2-cost 2/2, and anybody who's played Magic, particularly if you played back in the day, the idea of a 2-cost 2/2 always summons the image of the grizzly bear, the no text, totally boring 2-cost 2/2. So this Leia card obviously is better than a grizzly bear. And if the grizzly bear is sort of like par, if that's the floor for a 2-drop, I already feel like okay, she's met the grizzly bear, but she actually does a couple of things. She gives you a choice of either readying a resource or exhausting a unit. So the kind of cards that I thought of to compare her to. Now, immediately, I'm cheating a little bit with Mantis from the Versus system here because she's actually a 2-cost 2/3, which is not exactly the same stat block, but her power lets you, when she gets KO'd, she goes into your resource row. So she gives you like a little bit of ramp, and that's very similar to one of Leia's potential modes. She lets you ready a resource, so you get a little bit of ramp out of her. The other thing she does is exhaust a unit, which could be a disruptive effect. And one of the most disruptive 2-cost 2/2s I remember from my time in Magic the Gathering was the Meddling Mage here. So these were kind of the array of cards that I'm comparing Leia to from these other games. The Meddling Mage prevented you from actually playing cards, which is quite a bit better than just exhausting them. So that's maybe not the fairest comparison. But the idea of a card that has a totally solid stat block maybe lets you ramp and get a little extra stuff out, or lets you disrupt what your opponent's trying to do. I feel pretty safe saying I think this is probably going to be a decent card.
Yeah, I would agree that just based off what we know, like the 2/2 stat block, like we have to see a lot more cards to understand like what the designer's idea of a curve would look like. Um, to know like what a normal damage or attack value is for whatever resource, right? So we got to figure that out as we go. But just the her when played ability to either ready a resource and exhaust a unit, just that flexibility, I feel makes her viable and playable in a bunch of different deck game plans, right? So different archetypes. She could go well in a tempo deck or a ramp deck, or she has some control options. So I feel like it's a pretty good card, especially for a 2-drop.
Also, when you think about her in a limited environment, sealed or draft, cards that give you flexibility are even more valuable in those limited spaces. Now, most games first expansions tend to be like a little toned down on the complexity, a little toned down on the power level. Like they're building the foundation. And
Right.
looking at her from that perspective, this to me is not a wildly overpowerful game breaking crazy card, but this seems like a very solid body for 2 mana, assuming mana works the way it does in Hearthstone or Magic. Like again, we don't exactly know at this point. Um, but yeah, I think this looks like a pretty solid card that's going to see play throughout the early life of the game, would be my guess.
I would agree.
All right, we'll move on to Wing Leader. So this card is going to involve a little more guessing than Leia did. So this is a 3-cost 2/1. And again, I searched up some other units from other games that have a similar cost and stat block. But in the ability for this card, it gives 2 experience tokens to another friendly rebel. Now, we don't know from any official sources what experience tokens are, but for the purposes of this exercise that we're doing today, I'm just going to assume they operate like a +1/+1 counter. If that ends up not being the case, well, we have a disclaimer at the beginning of the video. So this is going to be cost you 3. It's going to get you a 2/1 body, and it's going to allow you to buff 2 other bodies, assuming they're specifically rebels. Now, how good that is going to somewhat degree depend on what kind of rebels you have out in play. Obviously, this card looks much worse if you don't get the buff, but let's assume you do get the buff and kind of compare it to some of these other cards that I have here. Now, the Amethyst Acolyte from the Eternal card game has the same cost, the same stat line, but rather than buffing your guys, he reaches over onto the enemy side of the field and puts a -1/-1 on somebody. And this card, at least within the era when I played Eternal, this was a card that saw a lot of play. And its kicker ability, its summon ability, does not go as far as the Wing Leader. Moving over to our Microtech controller here, this doesn't give a buff to existing units. It creates 2 additional units that each have 1/1. So this is very similar to what the Wing Leader is doing, except it doesn't require you to have the board set up in a particular way to get that benefit. And finally, the Bogarden Firefiend. This was maybe not a great card when I played Magic, but there were people in my group who really enjoyed just being as aggressive as possible. So this guy, you pay your 3, he comes down, maybe he kills something, and then when he dies, he deals 2 damage somewhere else. All 3 of these cards I'm comparing Wing Leader to are all cards that saw play both like in the casual kind of kitchen table way, but also in competitive decks in their respective games. So again, much like Leia, I feel pretty confident saying that the Wing Leader is a card that I expect to see play within Star Wars Unlimited. Banana?
Yeah, I feel like so. I'm pretty sure this is the only space unit that we see, right? So we don't know what those other space units look like. We don't know if that's how that compares to ground units. Is there a difference to ground units and how they like rubric the curves and everything? But if the experience tokens are +1/+1 counters early in the game, being able to buff your other dudes, especially like if you're playing it with Leia and like a tempo and you're trying to play a lot of things to the board, getting those +1/+1s early and often is going to be a good thing. The only other thing that I thought of possibly um, that an experience token might be, if it's not a +1/+1 counter, would be if certain cards are able to level up, like similar to versus system, where only
Oh,
your
that's
main
cool.
character
Yeah.
could level up. But I don't know if maybe some characters could level up to progress to like a, you know, like you have Farm Boy Luke and he gets experience tokens and can level up into Jedi Knight Luke. I don't know. It's just a
I am a big fan of how the level up conditions in Versus kind of tell a story. So you start with, your Bruce Banner, and then things happen to him, and he ends up becoming the Hulk. Seeing that in Star Wars Unlimited, I think, would be very cool as well. Like anytime that the cards can tell a story as well as be a fun game, like I'm a fan of that.
yeah. I think probably though, just based on how it's worded, it's probably some sort of +1/+1 counter. But I'm kind
Yeah,
of hoping that it
it's hard.
levels up cards.
Surely the game has +1 counters somewhere. Like that's kind of a staple in all of these type of card games at this point. We
Right.
just don't know exactly what it's going to look like. So I am kind of, again, this entire exercise is taking previous experience with other games and trying to apply that to Star Wars Unlimited, which may or may not be accurate, may or may not be fair.
It's a fun exercise either way.
All right. Any final thoughts on Wing Leader?
No, I hope I get to play it sooner rather than
Yeah.
later.
I'm hoping we get to see some cards at Gen Con, like for real. Like there's packs or starter decks or something.
That would be
Uh,
awesome.
all right, so Grand Moff Tarkin. This is a ground unit. He costs 4 and has a stat line of 2/3. Now, most of the time in card games, even if I don't know anything else about the card game, if this is a card has a cost and then card has an attack and defense, I'm assuming like a 4 cost 4/4 is going to be sort of the average. Now, that's not always true in every game, but immediately I look at a 4 cost 2/3, and in my head, I'm thinking this ability is going to have to be excellent or this card is not going to see play. So, his ability, when he's played, search the top 5 cards of your deck for up to 2 Imperial cards, reveal them, and draw them. Now, I do really like part of the way this is phrased. A lot of times when you see these types of effects in games, it'll say things to the effect of reveal the top 5 cards of your deck, then grab your Imperials. I like that you don't have to reveal them unless you actually get hits. You only reveal the cards if it's successful, which is better than it could be, but I still think this power is probably going to suffer in that this requires your deck to have Imperials. Now, how hard is that going to be? We don't know. Potentially, there'll be enough Imperials. This hits every single time. But to compare this card to some cards from other games, I've got a card from the Eternal card game here, and this doesn't have any power symbols along the top. This is what in Eternal is called a neutral card, and generally, neutral cards are more expensive than they need to be for the effect that they give you. And this Rotocycle is no exception to that. It has the ability to fly, which works pretty much the same way flight does in Magic. Cards that can't fly can't block this, and this thing can block opposing flyers. So this is 4 cost 2/3 is the kind of thing you grab if your draft is not going well and you just absolutely need something with wings. This is not a good card. So comparing it to Grand Moff Tarkin, we're not off to a great start here. The next example is one of my all-time favorite Magic cards, and not because it's a good card. I just loved this artwork. I loved trying to make this card work. It also flies, and when it comes into play, you have to return a card to your hand, which is not great. But if it hits somebody, if it actually hits a player, you get to pick a card from their hand and force them to discard it. Now, that's an awful lot of words on a
Yeah.
4 cost 2/3 to try to make it seem like it's playable. And I will tell you, this card was not very good in the Planeshift era of Magic. I loved it. I loved trying to make it work, but it was not very good. And finally, I actually have a Hearthstone card, the Infested Tauren, that features a 4 cost 2/3 that actually saw play, that was actually a competitively viable card. But notably, I think the most important part of what this card does, it has Taunt, which means you have to attack it before you could attack your opponent's health value. I guess in Star Wars Unlimited terms, you would have to hit the Infested Tauren before you could attack the base. But once this thing dies, it generates another 2/2 body to the board. And that's the key that made this a good card. This, kind of like Grand Moff Tarkin does, it gives you kind of a bad body for kind of a high cost, but it sets you up to have a little bit extra benefit down the way. Now, Infested Tauren spits that benefit straight out to the board. Grand Moff Tarkin puts that extra benefit into your hand. I predict that's going to be too slow. I predict this is not going to be a great card. What do you think, Banana?
So just a question about what you said. Do you think that that is too slow in a game where the like round structure is I take an action, you take an action?
It's hard. So I am taking a lot of baggage from other games. So when I say I'm predicting that it's going to be too slow, I'm thinking about Hearthstone. I'm thinking about Magic, and that might not be fair because none of those games have the I take an action, you take an action. So it is true to say that the cards you draw with Grand Moff Tarkin could still come into play that turn. So he could function the way the Infested Tauren does, where the benefit he gives you hits the board pretty quickly. But I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical of that. As somebody who played a lot of Destiny, so you're a little more familiar with the alternating action style of turns. What do you think? Do you think that I'm being too harsh on him by calling him too slow?
I think maybe. I think maybe. I think his viability comes down to how much that imperial trait like matters and how many cards have it, and is it worth building a deck around, right? So I think if imperial has support in this set, um, that he could be good. You know, anything to pull. So I guess we still don't have enough information to say for sure. But I think
Oh,
maybe you're
true.
being a little harsh saying that he's slow just because it's like if I play or like the infested Tarn, right? And then you have to attack it and kill it. Like that comes up right away. But I can't really react unless I have some sort of instant, right, in that game, some sort of counterplay with instant timing. We don't have to worry about that with him. He can draw the card, you could do your thing, and then I can play that the next turn, my next turn, that phase. So I think the speed's fine. I think it's more on if the Imperial trait matters or not.
Surely we would agree that if you play him and you look at 5 cards and you don't get any Imperial cards, that's terrible value.
Oh yeah, hundred
Like
percent,
without a doubt, right?
hundred
If you
percent.
only get 1 card, that's probably still not good enough. I'm
No, I
I'm
think you
guessing.
want to hit. I mean, one's better than none, but uh,
Yeah,
obviously, but
but that's still a bad day for Grand Moff.
yeah.
I
So I got
think. I predict.
I play I play Tarkin, I whiff, and then I hear, or maybe I don't. Never mind. It's supposed to
I
be,
like I like that you tried to play a sound effect,
and it didn't work.
but you for a whiff, but you whiffed the sound effect for the whiff. There's
Yeah.
like layers to that joke.
What the heck?
All right. Any other thoughts on Grand Moff Tarkin?
Nope.
All right. Well, we will move on and take a look at maximum firepower. So this is an event, and I actually found drawing comparisons for the event cards a lot harder than the units, because with the units I could just go cost, stat line. Okay, who do I remember from my misty memories of playing card games for all these years? But these events were a little bit tougher. So maximum firepower allows you to pick a friendly Imperial unit and deal damage equal to its power to a unit. And then another friendly Imperial unit deals damage equal to its power to the same unit. So I think it's really fair to classify this card as a removal spell. So that's one angle of looking at it. But the first card that I came up here to compare it to is a relatively recent versus 2 PCG card that came out in the Mortal Kombat set called Crushing Blow. And this one doesn't work quite the same way, but I think it captures some of the flavor in that it allows you, if you're in a melee combat, your character gets to strike and then it gets to strike again. Well, functionally, you strike with double your attack, but it kind of has the same flavor of two things hitting the same thing that maximum firepower did. Also, it's got a guy on fire, so that felt appropriate. Uh, During my time with Eternal, in Cold Blood was one of the most annoying removal cards that I have ever encountered in any game ever. So this just straight up lets you kill a thing. I just pay for, kill one thing, which is kind of what I think maximum firepower is going for. Now, In Cold Blood had the added advantage, though, that if you killed a thing of a certain color, in this case the Justice faction, the enemy player also has to discard all copies of that card from their hand. They all get stuck in the graveyard in the KO pile and they can't be removed, and they lose all of their influence of, and you lose all your influence of that color. So it's like a decent card to just kill a thing, but it had this ridiculous upside that only hit very specific decks, which I thought was kind of funny. And then finally, I remembered Flame Trap from the original Versus game, which rather than targeting one thing and trying to be a spot removal, this was a wide board removal card. So all in all, I know Flame Trap was good, although it doesn't totally match the same thing that Maximum Firepower is doing. And the other 2 cards I both think are good. So I think Maximum Firepower is going to be a really useful tool for Imperial decks, and it's going to be the way they deal with big, tall fatties that people are playing out on the other side. I think this is going to be the spot removal card for this faction or team or whatever they call it in this opening set.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. And funny enough, that Tarkin can pull maximum firepower. Um, it is an Imperial card, so Tarkin can search this out for you if you need it when that Vader deploys that we saw from the starter, and you want to get him off the board before his lightsaber comes on. Maximum firepower, right? So
That's a flavor home run too.
yeah,
Like Moff Tarkin comes out and then summons maximum firepower into your hand. That's a delicious flavor moment.
Yeah, but yeah, I think
Uh,
I agree though
oh, go
that
ahead.
this is going to be that aspect or faction or color or family or whatever it's called. Removal, right? Definitely removal. What
And
damage?
these cards are so important.
How much damage do you think this needs to do to be worth playing it? Like total, like is it 8? Do you want to hit something for 4 twice?
Well, if we assume that four, and again, this might not be a good assumption, but if we assume that 4 cost units are going to have on average 4 ish stats, then for this to be worth its salt, it's going to need to be able to kill things that have like 5. Yeah, probably 8. I think you're going to want to be able to have units out that can do somewhere in the 6 to 8 range to opposing characters or opposing units to make this worth it. I mean, of course there's going to be situations where there's a particular unit that has a certain power that you have to answer, and maybe it's okay that this only does 2 damage or overkill something. But in terms of reach, I think to feel good about investing 4 mana, I think about like a Hearthstone game. If you're putting 4 mana into a card, that's a lot of your turn. Even at maximum you can get in that game is 10. So this is almost half your turn to do this. So I think it needs to be able to kill most things. So I'd like to see it be able to reach up and clip cards that are like 8 drops. And if we're assuming 8 cost cards have like defenses of 8, that's kind of, yeah, I think somewhere in 6 to 8. That was a very long way of saying I agree with you.
All right.
And removal cards in general are just so important. Uh, maybe not every faction has great removal. Like certainly that's a way you can balance the asymmetry in card games. Is different teams or slices of the color pie have better or worse access to large removals, small removal, wide removal. But all the different types of removal spells are really archetype defining, because if you can't answer opposing threats, you lose to those threats. So I think 4 is a big cost, I admit, but if you're doing 8 damage with 4, I think you're probably going to feel pretty good about that, assuming your opponent's defense is not 9 or more.
Yeah.
And I think this is the last page here, and this one was the hardest one. So let me start by reading the card. So this is a 3 cost event. You're my only hope. Absolute classic artwork. I haven't commented on any of the artwork, but this piece right here is Star Wars to me in like capital bold letters. So this lets you look the top card of your deck. You may play it, and if it costs 5 less, if your base has 5 or less remaining hit points, you can play it for free instead. So I have so much to say about this card. First of all, the last line: if your base has 5 or less remaining hit points, you may play that card for free. That is not ever probably something you want to aim for. 5 is a very low number. We don't know how many hit points bases are going to have in this game, but I bet 5 means you're almost dead. So this could be in the flavor of a card called You're My Only Hope, hitting a top deck that bails you out of a bad situation. That could be a really cool moment in games, but that's not something we want to plan for. That plan A is never being almost dead in order for our cards to be good. Uh, Moving back up the card, it reduced the cost of the card by 5. That may be totally irrelevant. If the card costs 7 and you don't have the 2 mana, the reduction of 5 doesn't matter at all, because again, we want to assume we're not on death's door with our base. So this card, there's a couple situations I can think of where this card is absolutely unplayable, unacceptable, unplayable. If the games are actually so fast that the 7 minute number that was thrown around in the live stream ends up happening, maybe not all the time, but a lot of the time, then I would predict that we're not going to see enough of our decks to be able to pack big, expensive cards in them. And in a world where we don't have big, expensive cards in our deck, this card looks way worse. Discounting a 3 drop by 5 doesn't feel like you won. Like, that doesn't feel good. The
Right.
other major issue is deck manipulation. So this is a little bit of a shoehorn here, but I have the Soothsaying card from Magic the Gathering. This is one of my all-time favorite cards in any card game that I've ever played. The first line of text, it has a very expensive effect that lets you shuffle your entire deck, basically at will on your turn. But the next effect is you can pay X and look at the top X cards of your deck and then put them back in any order. This specific card came out before Magic started calling this ability Scry. It's called Agent and Versus. I'm sure there's a bunch of different terms for it across different card games. But the idea of being able to look at cards, choose the order you want them to hit the top of your deck, and replace them on your deck in that order. If effects like that exist in Star Wars Unlimited, that makes You're My Only Hope much, much, much better. If effects like that don't exist at all or are so scarce that you can't really count on them, that's not great for You're My Only Hope. And if that's true, and games are too fast to play 5, 6, 7, 8 drop cards in your decks, then this card is never going to see play. But we don't. I'm going to assume that that's not the case, and they're not going to put such cool art onto a card that can't see play. So I want to talk about a couple of cards from other games that have discount effects that are really, really good. Preparation, the Rogue spell from Hearthstone, is one of my favorite cards. It costs nothing, and the next thing you play costs 2 less. So Rogue as a class benefited a lot from playing lots of things per turn, and the preparation card absolutely facilitated that. So in a Rainbow Unicorn land where you pay 3 for Your My Only Hope and you hit a 5 drop and you get this bomb card into play that you didn't have to pay for, maybe you throw an upgrade on it after that because you have all this extra mana left over because you didn't have to pay for it. That all feels really, really good. The last example is Ifrit from the Final Fantasy TCG. And this guy, if you have played a fire forward onto the field, like on your side of the board this turn, he gets discounted by 3. And that is, I think, the best example of that kind of discount. You give somebody the discount for doing something they wanted to do anyway. I want to be able to play a card to my side of the board. If I do it, then I get to play this spell for free. Well, technically, it's a summon and deal 7,000 damage to something. You're My Only Hope does not quite check the Ifrit box. I think in order for this card to be even playable, we're going to need to see slow games with expensive cards and or the ability to manipulate the top of your deck. So there's a lot of things I like about this card, but unfortunately I have to give it a tentative thumbs down. I think this card is going to need too much help in order to be good, so I don't think it's going to see play. What do you think?
I think of the cards we've looked at today, this is probably the one I like the least. Um, I agree with you. If this doesn't have other, if they, if there's not cards that let you look at the top of your deck so you know what's there, I don't think this is going to see play. I think you need to know. You got to be able to know what you're going to hit. I think if you're playing to win as the top deck at the end of a game, I think you're probably going to lose most of your games. Um, yeah, I mean the ability to play something for 5 less is awesome if there's cool cards and if you can make sure you're hitting the right stuff. But other than that, I'm
I I
not keen
will
on it.
say, in defense of like casual players, there are absolutely going to be games where people play this card and they hit a 5 cost or they hit a 7 cost and they have the 2 extra mana left over, resources left over, and they can play it and they're able to get like a game winning bomb unit into play on the back of it. This will happen. Like,
Mm,
it, is it going to happen at tournament tables? Is it going to happen consistently? Probably not. But if it happens in one sealed game for somebody and everybody goes, whoa,
right.
that's probably pretty cool too. So I am being a little harsh on the card because I do kind of analyze these from a competitive standpoint. But I want to acknowledge that this is one of those gambly cards that probably isn't going to be consistent. But when it hits, it's going to make everybody around the card table like their eyes go wide and their hands go up. You know.
Yeah. Yeah. And this would be awesome to see. Like, yeah, I agree. It'd be awesome, like in a draft or at a sealed event, to see somebody pull some off with this card. But unless we see stuff that helps it to hit consistently, it's probably gonna stay in the binder.
Yeah. I mean, and it could be a sleeper. You know, it could be set 3, set 4, where we finally see scry or agent type effects that let us manipulate the top of the deck, and then this card could come out of the binder. I I have a really hard time believing they're going to give us deck manipulation cards in set 1, especially if they want this game to be new player friendly. Looking the kind of decision points that looking at the top 4 or 5 cards of your deck and choosing the order they go back in, those are not new player friendly decision points.
Yeah, they're not very casual friendly either, right? Like,
Yeah. And that's not to say the game can't ever have them. It's just set 1 is probably, as much as I love that complexity, I think Argent Saga, a recently, somewhat recently dead card game that I really, really loved. I think one of their mistakes was coming out in set 1 with extremely complicated generating things out of the KO pile, all kinds of deck manipulation. They swung a little too hard by appealing to like the hardest of hardcore card game people, which is probably why I fell in love with the game. But that makes it really hard to find that casual audience, that foundational audience that you really need in order to thrive in the long term. So,
yeah, I
and
think
I think FFG is probably aware of that. So I suspect we won't see Scry in set 1. Sorry, I cut you off there, man.
sorry, I think a word you just said there is really important was foundational, right? For set one, laying the groundwork for the entire community, the entire future of the game. You want to get that right. So you want to be able to appeal to the competitive players that want to jump into it, but you gotta do it right and ease them in so that it's not too complicated that the new players are scared off, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I think getting that foundation right is super important. I think they're aware.
Okay, well, was there anything else you wanted to hit here at the end? Any of the cards that we maybe brushed past something that you wanted to talk about?
No, I think we covered it pretty well. Um, Hopefully, we get to see some more cards soon.
Yep. Okay, I guess that kind of brings us to the end of this little short episode we did here. So I'll see you in the arenas.
Yeah, see you in the arenas. This party's over.